Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazzo.
Hey friends, thank you so much for tuning in, for sharing the podcast. God bless you. Very important show every time we do one of these now. Almost every one of them leading up to this big election. There's a lot of information to talk about. There's a lot of lies to refute because, man, the enemy is good at deception and propaganda. So let's bring in today's guest. Bill Federer is back with us. AmericanMinute.com is the website. A couple of books that we want to tell you about. The one we just had him on a couple months ago, I think we talked about silence equals consent. Also, we've got the book, The Strength and Genius of Booker T. Washington. And Bill, let me bring you in right now and we'll just get this thing going. Welcome.
Hey, great to be with you, Dave.
Good to see you again. So the one on socialism, what was that title again, please?
It's called Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And the subtitle is How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control. In a nutshell, the most common form of government in world history is kings. Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsars. Democracies and republics are attempts to take the power of the king, give it to the people. But what if the king wants the power back? Is he just going to ask for it? No. So there's two methods. One is fear. If you can get people into fear, they will voluntarily surrender their freedom in exchange for security. And the second is free stuff. If they can get the people dependent on the government, they'll incrementally give up their freedom to keep the free stuff coming. Sort of like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He comes in with guns, gets everybody into fear, or he's so nice he's giving away free drugs till you get hooked. And so these are methods in which governments can take power away from the people and reconcentrate it back into the hands of a dictator.
So thank you for updating us on that and just sharing that right there. We did talk with you on that. If people want to go to worldviewmatters.tv and in the search, just type in Bill Federer, the previous episodes will come up. And we talked about that. We talked about psychological projection, which we will also talk a little bit more about today because it's still going on. Every election, leading up to every election, there's a lot of lies, Bill, a lot of deception. And people, unfortunately, don't do their research. They don't know their history, and they fall for the talking points. Would you care to comment on that before we dive into more?
Sure. So Cold War, for nearly 50 years, the East and West have been doing proxy wars. So the Soviet Union would try to take Western-leaning countries and co-opt the media and begin to release negative information about the country's leader until they drop in popularity, and then they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader, and nobody would challenge it because by that time they believed the lies and they wanted to get rid of it. And so the CIA learned how to do that in reverse. One example is 1953. Iran was beginning to side with the Soviet Union. Their leader, Mossadegh, and Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, approved Operation Ajax and sent over Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. And he co-opted mafia and gangs and mobsters and co-opted the media and began to cause problems and blame the problems on the country's leader, Mossadegh. And when his popularity fell, they put him under house arrest, locked him away for the rest of his life where he dies, replaced him with the Shah. So these tactics were used in other countries, but Obama in 2012 decided to turn and use these tactics on the American people. And he even issued an executive order. It's called Executive Order Using Behavioral Science Insights to Better Serve the American People, September 15th, 2015. So what's behavioral science insights? It's PSYOPs. It's psychological operations. It's basically co-opting the media and making whatever viewpoint the government wants look like the one everybody is going to, and you'll feel the subconscious pressure to fit in because we're social creatures, and then maligning and canceling opposing viewpoints. And then to top it all off, in 2016, Obama signed the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which gave him control over the mainstream media and the narrative for the sake of national security to weed out foreign propaganda. And of course, the question is raised, are you also weeding out Democrat propaganda? Probably not. And so the same way that Obama met with Lois Lerner 147 times, one of the heads of the IRS.
Yep.
And then Lois Lerner began to target conservative organizations. We began to see this weaponization of bureaucracy against the political opponents of that particular party. And that's the gang structure. So a gang leader, if you're friends with the gang leader, you're more equal. You're not friends with the gang leader, you're less equal. You're an enemy, you're dead. And so you just turn that into kings or leaders of countries. If you're friends of the party in power, you're a part of the deep state and you get favors. If you're not, you're less, and so forth. So anyway, so these are tactics that have been studied in marketing of products. So instead of Sears catalog and Wells Fargo wagon and Disney, they've taken marketing of products into marketing of ideologies. And the same way that we're social creatures, we want to wear the whole fashion industry. You want to wear what you see other people wearing. They've used that to, like little kids, they want to wear the frozen T-shirts and frozen pajamas and frozen Band-Aids and frozen lunch boxes because Disney's pushing it. They've just taken that to push ideologies. And it's important for us to understand that these tactics are being used on us every day.
And they have been for a long time. And I'm glad you brought up Lois Lerner. I'm glad you brought up what the IRS did leading up to that election. They were not giving conservative or Christian groups or nonprofits status. They were not giving them 501c3. They were delaying them, a lot of red tape, making them jump through hoops. Well, everyone that applied for a liberal 501c3, they just went through no problem. But let's go back to the media, and that's why I wanted to have you on again, Bill, because what you just experienced was very interesting. Before we get to that, and we're talking about a letter you received from Slate and accusations about you that were not accurate. Before we do that, what we're talking about is the media and how the left pretty much controls most media, and everything is kind of veered to the left now. For years and years and years, things are going leftward. And there it is. There's the chart. So, Bill, on that chart, Slate is on there. That's one of the many, many, many leftist outlets that call themselves maybe journalists or a news source, but they're not really news, as you shared. So how did this all come about, where your interaction with a Molly Olmstead from Slate, she's a writer over at Slate, and she contacted you about something and said that you were, pushing the MAGA agenda? How did that go?
Right. So Christians are beginning to wake up and realize that it's okay to get involved and vote. And the left doesn't like that. Yeah. And so they've been pushing this narrative that where they give money to woke seminaries to teach Christians not to get involved in politics. Yeah. While at the same time, they're giving money to their LGBTQ Gaza activists to get them involved in politics. And so I go through how, in my Silence Equals Consent book, where in New England, you actually had churches founding cities. Like Providence, Rhode Island was founded by the First Baptist Church in America. And so everybody's involved in church, everybody's involved in city government, but they don't like that. And so they want to malign anybody. And they do something called projection, where they blame you for what they're doing. So in the Bible, Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was lusting after him. So they claim that the people on the right want to push dominionism and white supremacy and Christian nationalism, when actually they're the ones that are wanting to push a woke nationalism. They're the ones that are wanting to push an agenda that takes away freedoms. And the Christians that founded America, they fled from governments that were mandating beliefs, and they wanted to have freedom of conscience over here. Matter of fact, the very concept of freedom of conscience came from Christians. But anyway, so they're trying to push a narrative that white people are racist. And when you go back in history, it's not a black-white issue; it's a Democrat-Republican issue.
Interesting.
And so Andrew Jackson was the first, and so they wanted to question my research that in the early 1900s, Tuskegee Institute did research, and they documented 4,743 lynchings. And then they documented that about 1,200 of those were white Republicans in the South that were starting all the historic black colleges They were started by, former Union generals and Republicans, and how the Republicans were registering the freed blacks to vote, and the Democrats didn't like that, and they would lynch them too. So about 1,200 of the lynchings were people down in the South helping the freed blacks. And so she didn't like that statistic because it pointed out how the Democrats were the ones who started the KKK. And so in my response, I bring up how it was the first Democrat president, Andrew Jackson, who owned slaves. And then a Democrat senator from Mississippi, his name was Jefferson Davis. And he said African slavery as it exists is a political blessing. And then the Democrat states would pass Jim Crow laws and black codes, which made it a crime to teach blacks to read, made it a crime for them to have any weapon at all. Frederick Douglass, the Republican advisor to Abraham Lincoln, wrote when he was a young slave boy, his slave master's sister-in-law was teaching him to read. And her husband walks in, yells at her, and says, "Don't you dare teach slaves to read. It's illegal." And Frederick Douglass said that was the first sermon that convinced him that he wanted to learn how to read, right? And so then you had the Lincoln was the first Republican president. And he is the one who issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and then, of course, the 13th Amendment freeing the slaves. And then I go through the founding of the Republican Party. So Democrats pushed through the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. And what's that? That's if a slave happened to escape from the South, Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad, if they happened to escape to the North and you found out about it, you had to go to the federal government and snitch on them and help turn them in. And so you had northern Republican states refusing to comply with this federal law. Could you imagine that? States flat out telling the federal government, no, we're not going to. And so a slave named Joshua Glover runs away from St. Louis, Missouri, a slave city, and he gets to Racine, Wisconsin, a free city, and he's working in a sawmill, and the sheriff from St. Louis goes to Racine, bribes somebody to show him the house, and they bust in and club Joshua Glover in the face, throw him in the back of the wagon, put him in a wagon, and take him to a jail in Milwaukee. And when the people of Milwaukee found out about this, 5,000 Milwaukee citizens, mostly white people, storm the jail and free Joshua Glover.
Wow.
And they rush him off to Canada. And then just a week later, those same predominantly white Wisconsins meet in a city called Ripon, Wisconsin, in a schoolhouse, and they form a party called the Republican Party. And the original platform was to eliminate the twin relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy. And so slavery was not a white-black issue. It was a Democrat-Republican issue. It wasn't a hardware problem. It was a software problem. It wasn't a skin color problem. It was a brain problem. And so then you have another slave that's named Dred Scott. I was formerly on the board of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation in St. Louis until I moved away. Dred Scott went with his master from St. Louis to Illinois and Wisconsin, and then went back. And if he would have known the law, he could have just walked away from his master. But now he's back in Missouri, so some friends bring a lawsuit to get him free. And it was Republican Congressman Henry Blow, B-L-O-W. His wife started the first kindergarten in America. Anyway, he brings the lawsuit. They works its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Democrat Justice Roger Taney said slaves are so far inferior, they should be enslaved for their own benefit. And of course, that was the Dred Scott case. And Abraham Lincoln referred to this. He gave a speech. He goes, 2 weeks ago, Judge Douglas spoke here, this is 1857, on the Dred Scott decision. He finds Republicans insisting that the Declaration of Independence includes all men, black as well as white. He boldly denies that it includes Negroes. I protest that. Chief Justice Taney, in his opinion in the Dred Scott case, admits the language of the Declaration is broad enough to include the whole human family, but Judge Douglas argues that the author of that instrument did not intend to include Negroes. I think the authors of that noble instrument did intend to include all men. Dred Scott, his wife, his two daughters. And then Lincoln said how differently the respective courses of the Democrat and Republican parties. Republicans inculcate that the Negro is a man, that his bondage is cruelly wrong. Democrats deny manhood, deny and dwarf or insignificance the wrong of his bondage. And so shortly after that, Lincoln's elected president, the Civil War starts, and you even had Union General Ulysses S. Grant said, when we heard that the slavery had fired upon the Union, everybody in America said we need to end slavery. And so the country was divided in five. The radical Republican North, those were the Christians that got fired up from the Second Great Awakening revival, and they said slavery's wrong, end it now. And then the moderate Rhino North, and they were Republicans that said slavery's wrong, but we got to transition out of it over time. And then the amoral neutral that didn't care about social issues and human life and slavery, they just cared about taxes and wages and tariffs. And then the moderate Democrat South that said slavery's wrong, but you got to live with it, spend it for centuries, just treat your slave nice. And then the extreme Democrat South that said slavery's good, let's expand it to all these new territories coming into the Union. And so that was the situation in America. Again, not a black-white issue, a Democrat-Republican issue.
That's right. And friends, there's a lot of history, even more than what Bill is sharing with us now, that you can get on the website, AmericanMinute.com. This is in the blog called Is Liberal Slate Publication Trustworthy? Because Slate was the ones that they contacted Bill saying he made misrepresentations or misleading assertions. We'll talk more about that with Bill Federer when we come back on Worldview Matters.
Today's show is brought to you by Harbinger's Daily, world news biblically understood. Stay informed at harbingersdaily.com.
If you want to follow us on Rumble, please go over there and just click like or follow, however you do that. And we're growing thanks to you. And also, we have a free app on your iPhone, the Freedom Project Media app. You can download that for free. Bill Federer, AmericanMinute.com, our guest today. It's going by fast, Bill. I knew it would with you. I love what this gal at Slate wrote the very last sentence. Please let me know if there's anything that needs to be corrected, clarified, or changed. And she gave you a deadline. And man, did you ever respond. Guys, if you can scroll on that page, just scroll down if you can do that. There we go. Keep going. Just keep going. Let's show people how long that is, how much history, Bill, you put in there, so much research and history. It keeps going, and you sure did share a lot about the truth. And one of my questions for you is why, well, I was going to say, why don't they teach these things in public schools anymore? We kind of know the answer to that. But was this ever taught in schools? Because people today, the average person, would think the Republicans are racist and the Democrats are always pro-black and they never supported slavery. But the opposite is true. Go ahead.
Right. So Lyndon Johnson did the big switch in the 1960s. He had the Great Society welfare state. And for those not familiar, you had the Democrats filibustering a civil rights bill in the 1960s. For like months, the Republicans were wanting to give more civil rights to blacks, and the Democrats were filibustering it. And with the advent of television and with scenes of Democrat Commissioner of Birmingham, Bull Connor, hosing down blacks on the streets and sicking dogs on them, Lyndon Johnson said, this is not going to bode well for our party. People are going to see what we've been doing. And so he decided to get the Democrats governors on his Air Force One, and he tells them we're going to do a switch. And he says, I'll have these, and he uses the N-word, voting Democrat the next 200 years. The switch was from intimidation to entitlement. Instead of sticking dogs on them, they would get them to sign up for welfare. It's the bribe or the bullet, the silver or the lead. And so the idea is, if we're not going to intimidate them from getting involved in voting, let's destabilize their families and their homes and their economies and get them to sign up for welfare. And then they'll be in a position of wanting to continue to have it come. And then Lyndon Johnson also changed the immigration quotas in 65 to bring in less people with a traditional Judeo-Christian work ethic, where it was a social stigma to receive welfare. And he brought in more people from poor third world countries because they didn't have that stigma. They would sign up for welfare. And once you signed up people for free money, a good percentage will want to keep it coming. And so it was a way to build a Democrat voter base. It's called the Cloward-Piven strategy.
Yes.
Richard Cloward, Francis Piven, Columbia University professor, says you can't bring socialism into America with tanks. You have to do the back door, destabilize the economy, get people to be financially hurting. They'll come to the government, ask for help, and you give them the money, and they'll want to keep it coming, and you'll have built a voter base. And,
so is the open borders agenda, and for lack of a better word, agenda, is that part of this Cloward-Piven strategy to overwhelm the system? And another purpose, of course, is to get these people to vote Democrat, right?
Right. So about 12 million that we know of have come across the border since Biden's been in. He immediately, one of his very first things was to stop the building of the border wall. So he wanted to bring them in. And why? Well, voters, because then there's this mad effort of the government to have them sign up to be voters. You don't vote with your name, so they don't even have to vote. They just want their name on the list because they can do voter fraud up to the number of the names, and all they do is say it was a big turnout this year. But the other is a little more nefarious. If you can bring them in and into big cities and sign up for welfare, and then crime goes up. When crime goes up in the big city, what happens? Well, pro-family people decide to move out. Well, pro-family people, they seem to be a higher percentage Republican. And pro-small business people move out. How are you going to shop when there's crime? And pro-small business, they're a higher percentage Republican. Who's left in the city? More people on welfare. Well, they're a higher percentage Democrat. And guess what? Everyone who left the city, their name stays on the voter rolls. And so they can do voter fraud up to the number of the names and nobody questions it. And if they win the big city, they end up winning the entire state. If they win the state, they get all the electoral votes for the state, and the president's elected by electoral votes. They literally have a political agenda that includes crime going up in the cities intentionally. Yep. So pro-family, pro-business people leave, their name stays on the voter rolls, they can do voter fraud, nobody notices. And if they win the city, they win the state, they get all the electoral votes, they can vote in the president. Wow. It's sad that people think this way. But I mean, if you think of it, if killing babies is in their party platform, what's voter fraud? I mean, that's nothing.
Exactly. I want to just what you just said. If killing babies is in their platform, I mean, yeah, voter fraud is cheating and lying and stealing elections maybe, but we're talking about life, preborn human lives in mothers' wombs, and that is a huge part of their platform. It's a sacrament to the left, let's face it. Bill, we only have 4 minutes left, and I did want to go back to your article briefly. And there's a lot of maybe misunderstandings or confusion about the 13th and the 14th Amendment, particularly the 14th Amendment, which 100% of Democrats voted against the 14th Amendment in 1868. What was that about?
Right. So the first 10 amendments were the states limiting the federal government's power. But the 13th Amendment, pushed through by Lincoln, ended slavery. And it was the federal government telling the states no more slavery. Well, in the Deep South, they were forced to free the slaves, but then they would pass these Jim Crow laws, black codes. They would do the sharecropping, where they would make the slaves, they're free, but they would make them like permanent tenant farmers and take away their money. And they were being treated really bad. And so the Republicans pushed through the 14th Amendment to force the southern states to give rights to the freed slaves. And this was pushed through completely by Republicans. And there's 13,000 pages of testimony of the blacks being persecuted. Even going to the election, you used to carry your ballot with you to the polling place and just drop it in the box. But because so many blacks were being accosted by the KKK and even lynched, that they introduced an idea borrowed from Australia. And that's to have the names of all the candidates already pre-printed inside of the polling place. So you didn't have to carry a ballot with you. You would just go. So the very way that we vote today goes back to trying to protect blacks from being lynched on the way to the polling place because used to carry your ballot with you.
Wow. I mean, that's just some amazing history that we forget about. I want to point out before we let you go, one of the most recent blogs, The Hellhound of Slavery, John Quincy Adams, anti-slavery champion because of his faith, his Christian faith. There's an article there. Also, the Booker T. Washington book, The Strength and Genius of Booker T. Washington. Just tell us a little bit about that briefly, Bill, because I don't think we've mentioned that on the show before.
Right. So Booker T. Washington was born a slave, and he remembers one of his first memories is his mom kneeling over him and praying that Lincoln's armies would be successful so that they would be free. Mm-hmm. And he writes about, how they were called down to the master's house and some man came with a piece of paper and read it and he didn't know what it was, but everybody started crying. And he said, his mom said, "This was the day I've been praying for." And anyway, he and his family went to the North, West Virginia. He went to the Hampton Institute, and then later he became the president of Tuskegee University, and he was a Republican. And he was the first Black man invited to the White House as an honored guest for dinner by Republican Teddy Roosevelt. And so Tuskegee Institute hired George Washington Carver. And just a fascinating story of success of Booker T. Washington. Again, when he went from slavery to college president, and then he had an international impact. And he said, the best way to lift yourself up is to lift up somebody else. He says, I don't want you to just get a job. I want you to create jobs. He says, I don't want you just to be tolerated. I want you to be needed, where people will want you. And just a fascinating man, Booker T. Washington.
That's great. Friends, you can get that at AmericanMinute.com under products, along with other books by Bill Federer. And remember to get all this history on the article regarding Slate, liberal Slate publication. That's from last month, but it's so relevant because of your response to her and all the factual history, there it is, that you put in that article. Bill Federer, thank you for the work that you do for speaking the truth. We know that silence is consent. We hope more Christians will get to the polls and vote in this upcoming election. Thanks so much for your time again, brother.
Thank you, Dave.
All right. God bless you always. It's just so good, guys, to go back and understand how much history we either forgot or maybe didn't learn in the first place. And the younger generations don't know this. So God bless you. And as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter.